Hey everybody, today is Monday, November 25th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Wicked Part 1, editor Myron Kerstein.
I was like, okay, you wanted to do fantasy? Check. You want to do a big musical? Check. You want to do something that feels like an epic Hollywood saga? Check, check, check. And now get going. I knew that I needed everybody to be working as a team and handle this from the VFX to the music editing. I just knew I needed the Avengers of musicals and VFX to help me through that process. I kind of can't stand the idea of anybody dictating how I'm going to approach a scene until I start cutting it.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, greetings, my friends. Matt Fury here. I suppose if we're really friends, you know that already. You probably also know this is a podcast called The Rough Cut. It's about film and TV editing, primarily. And if you are a relatively new listener to the show, you would not be wrong to think it's a podcast about musicals. Because today we are covering our second musical in a row, and our third in the past 5 weeks. We did Joker Folie à Deux, that was a musical. Last week we did Emilia Perez, that's a musical. In fact, we started this year off with a musical when we covered The Color Purple. Well, today we got another. And not just any musical. We have one of the most anticipated films of the year. What's with all the anticipation? Well, that is just what you get when you're adapting a beloved, long-running Broadway musical. The musical is Wicked. And coincidentally, the film is called Wicked. Part 1, to be precise. Part 2 is due out next year. Which means we have plenty of time to talk about Part 1. Taking the editorial helm on Wicked's Part 1 and 2 is our pal Myron Kerstein, an editorial wizard in his own right. Myron has been on the show before to talk about his work on Tick, Tick, Boom, which he cut for Lin-Manuel Miranda. Now there's a guy who knows a thing or two about musicals. And prior to that, Myron was on to talk about In the Heights, another musical. And that one was with Wicked director Jon M. So if you're following along, Wicked is the third musical in a row that Myron edited, and it is also the third film he has done with Jon Chu. They first collaborated on the non-musical Crazy Rich Asians. Wicked stars Cynthia Erivo as the misunderstood girl with the green skin, Elphaba. It also stars Ariana Grande Butera as Glinda, an all-too-perfect girl who just wants to be popular and a little magical. Elphaba and Glinda become roommates at Shiz University. Shiz is like Hogwarts, but with a lot of singing and dancing. I applied to Shiz. Got waitlisted. Anyway, Glinda and Elphaba are polar opposites that somehow forge a friendship. A friendship that will get put to the test in the Emerald City of Oz. It's a fun story, and it's a big story. From a big musical that Jon Chu and Myron Kerstein turned into 2 movies. And we will talk with Myron about the first one in just a minute, but first we got to turn up the music on our sponsor, Extreme Music. When they are not busy sponsoring this podcast, Extreme Music provides film and TV makers like you with the very best in production audio. Audio made by the top names in music making. Names you would be thrilled to have in your end credits. And dropping by extrememusic.com is really all you have to do to make that happen. Once you're there, you can search their catalog with keywords like tempo, genre, composer, and any other little hints you want to give to them, and they will find you just what you need. You can customize the instrumentation of the tracks you get back. You can choose different track links. You could even use their amazing reference track feature to give them a track so they can find you ones just like it. All of that stuff, as well as the licensing, can be done online. Or they have actual human beings, real nice people who can talk you through it. So the next time you have a story to tell, be it a movie, a TV show, an ad, or some other thing I can't think of, make sure to visit those musical munchkins at extrememusic.com. All right, my friends, time to follow the yellow brick road to the cutting room of Wicked Part 1. Awaiting us there, editor Myron Kerstein.
And specifically a younger generation to discover this material and have positive messages, and that's all I've ever wanted to do in my career, to be perfectly honest.
Well, you did it.
I could talk to you all day. I'm so happy to finally talk about this film with you.
All right, we got to set the Wayback Machine here. So last time we spoke, you were riding high on the success of Tick, Tick, Boom, and rightfully so. And I believe you casually mentioned to me, like, oh, I'm going to be working on Wicked with Jon Chu, and it's going to be 2 films, and I'm off to London, and I'll probably see you again in like 100 years. In the end, it wasn't that long, but I'm sure it felt like a long time. But let's go back to 2022 and Jon bringing you this opportunity, what he said to you about it, and just the timeline of the past 2 years for you.
I mean, it was sort of out there as something that was in development hell. And I thought this was never to get made. And then Jon heard that there might be an opening. And so when he told me that this might be our next film, of course, I was pretty excited because Jon and I joke all the time that we've been training for this moment all our lives, and we say that for every film. And the truth is, In the Heights and Tick, Tick, Boom gave me a skill set to handle a bigger musical, but then this was a bigger musical, like on steroids big. And so I was very excited, but also right away I was like, okay, I have to start thinking about this and how am I going to tackle this and what team am I going to put together once I can start hiring people, just because I knew that I needed everybody to be working as a team and handle this from the VFX to the music editing. I just knew I needed the Avengers of musicals and VFX to help me through that process. You know, I'm a huge musical fan, and I grew up loving The Wizard of Oz and epic movies like Sound of Music, and I got to finally get to make something of that scale. So you know, I was extremely excited, extremely intimidated. As soon as I got to England and started walking through the sets, which basically felt like I was walking through a theme park, the stakes were even higher. I was like, okay, well, this is time to walk the walk, you know? And I was like, okay, you wanted to do fantasy? Check. You want to do a big musical? Check. You want to do something that feels like an epic Hollywood saga? Check, check, check. And now get going. So I was there for 8 months, shooting 2 movies, sort of like block shooting, and gave everything I had for the last 2 years.
How has your process with Jon changed, if at all, having had the experience of In the Heights with him and then doing Tick, Tick, Boom? What has changed? What has been refined to put you in a position to take on something of such a huge scale?
There's just more trust there. I feel like a co-parent now with Jon's films. Like I am nurturing this baby with these thousands of decisions. But then, you know, I'm pitching shots, not only during production, but in post-production, you know, full CG shots. I'm pitching, obviously, scenes in and out, ways to get into scenes, transitions, style of editing, sound design, tone of score, everything. But that's all built on trust. And he just allows me to really nurture this baby more than ever. And I think that having something like Crazy Rich Asians, which there was a sense of scale to that and choices of performance that he started understanding my taste was aligned with his taste. And then In the Heights, we knew that we were aligned on how to cut a musical number. And so more and more, it just sort of let me do what I want to do.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't follow up on something you just said, which is part of your co-parenting duties is pitching a style of editing. That's not something I usually ask editors because I figure it's just, well, it's the magic of what I do. But how would you describe the style of editing that you wanted to use with Wicked?
Oh boy, now I got myself in trouble.
That's why I don't ask.
Look, at the end of the day, the style sort of presents itself from the scene. You know, something like, what is this feeling? I wanted to be playful with these split screens because I was really inspired by Ari's performance. It made me feel like I was watching Audrey Hepburn. I was like, let's do something that was very specific to that type of movie, like Pillow Talk or something like that. So that was very sort of flamboyant in the cutting. I could show off a little bit more with a musical number like that versus something like The Wizard and I, which is very traditional musical sort of Sound of Music style where we'll watch somebody cross over shiz singing in this song versus Defying Gravity, which I don't think anybody's seen anything like that before. And so that's sort of more in my head about, well, okay, we need to focus the scope. We have to feel grounded at times. We have to feel like this giant ending that feels like Empire Strikes Back. You know, I'm just sort of like pulling from all kinds of different ideas to make quote unquote a style. Other than that, I think the scene has to sort of help guide me about how I'm going to cut the scene. Usually it's always performance based. I just really let performance guide me. And if anything on this film, I was a little bit more restrained I restrained myself rather, because I didn't, In the Heights, I really focused a lot on the community. I cut to them a lot. I focused on that sort of energy. And then, you know, in Tick, Tick, Boom, it was much more sort of Jonathan Larson's like process in his head. This was a whole other sort of kettle of fish, you know?
Well, for a question that's hard to answer, you did a great job answering it.
Oh.
So you talked about working for 8 months, doing essentially 2 films. We're now enjoying part one. Part two comes out a year later. Where are you with part two? Are you done with your duties on both films?
No, we have a long way to go in part two. In fact, we've just began. I'd be remiss to not say that I brought on Tatiana Regal to help me sort of work on the dailies while I was trying to tackle the first movie. I was just like, can you help me assemble the second movie? Because it was just too overwhelming. So I brought her in a good 6 months in the shoot where I was just like, I just can't do this anymore. So she helped me assemble the second movie, and then she left, and then I continued to work on the first and the second movie together because the studio wanted to see both movies, and then we put it to sleep. Because, you know, at the end of the day, we just didn't have the bandwidth to work on both movies, let alone the resources because of VFX vendors, what have you. We had a separate project for both movies, and so it was very easy to sort of open one up and get back to it, but we just thought it was just too much. So I opened it up again. I said hello to it again a couple weeks ago, and then we're on a brief hiatus for the release, and then we'll be back to it.
We've discussed a few times now just the sheer scale of this film. As I understand it, shot on 17 different stages on 4 backlots, 2 of which were just ginormous, like football field size sets. Just to help understand the volume of material, the type of material that you're dealing with, what was Jon, shooting in terms of cameras, and upwards of how many would he be working with at one time to capture these giant performances?
Yeah, there could be up to, I want to say 5 cameras, especially in the stuff with like Munchkinland and Emerald City. He almost always has a second camera on everything, except for the intimate scenes where it's single camera, basic performance. But as far as the numbers, you know, there could be 2 to 5 cameras sort of rolling at once, which is great to have all those options, but it's also a mountain of footage for sure. He also does these big rolling takes. You know, Oz's Ballroom, he had these 10-minute takes from beginning of Cynthia coming in the room to the very end of the number. And that was to just allow the performance to just sort of build naturally. And then he'll often do resets as well.
With a musical, the planning ahead of time must be just incredible and meticulous. Does that dictate certain things that you need to work on first in post for whatever reason?
I mean, the schedule really dictates how we shoot the movie. We shot all the dorm room stuff first up. So we had stuff like Popular and What Is Feeling, some of it at least, shot first. And then Defying Gravity, which was literally our most important thing we had to shoot, we shot after the strike. We had, quote unquote, finished principal without finishing principal. But, you know, unless Jon says I need to know what the cut is right away, or I feel like I need to pick up a shot or something, I don't rush myself as far as cutting. I have my process, which was watch the dailies in a screening room. I built a screening room in London and in LA, and watch those dailies like I'm the first audience member. And then I'm going to start taking notes on a spreadsheet. Then I go back and do my selects, and then I start cutting and building. Of course, VFX has, you know, some other ideas about that, you know, so there was a lot of pressure from them to deliver things in order for them to get started. You know, everything from the Chistry transformation to the balloon chase, which I was pitching ideas with VFX to Jon about how to make that sequence have like a ticking clock. And so that's where the whole thing with the roof closing, like all that stuff wasn't scripted. And so when I saw the footage that he shot and second unit shot, was like, well, we need other things to help raise the stakes. So that type of thing ends up kind of being queued up at the front of the line a bit, because, you know, if you don't pitch that stuff while they're still shooting, then the chances you going back and fixing it later are slim.
Well, Myron, I don't know if anybody told you, but editors just push buttons.
Yeah.
What are you doing solving big story problems?
Yeah, and it's funny, like, even at this scale, you're doing that, but the stakes are higher as far as solving story issues or trying to get shots from second unit that Alice Brooks, who's our DP, may not have picked up, or Jon, you know, who's like running around between 2 movies. You're sort of the guardian of everything. And if you're not there to see if something's missing, no one else is going to say it. That's for sure.
Well, you started to get into your process for how you begin to build a scene based on some notes I've seen online. You had about 250 hours of footage, I think, for both films.
Yes, correct.
Are there techniques that you use, processes you've evolved over the years that make it easier to take such a huge amount of footage and turn it into a big movie?
I've learned that process is everything as far as not rushing it. It's the same process if it was an hour of footage or 250 hours of footage, which is I watch in a screening room. I take notes of things that make me laugh and cry. I'll do that with every camera. If it's just too unmanageable, I'll build selects based on those notes or based on just watching the footage together. And then I start cutting. Of course, I have an amazing team, and Laura Caccioni is my first. And, I have a huge murder's row of assistants under her who were both in London and back in the States to organize very quickly for me and allow me to start my process. And what I've learned is that if I don't rush it, then eventually 250 hours becomes less overwhelming. And I have these little bite-sized chunks that I can just deal with. At first, I literally saying, how am I going to do this? And by the end, I'm like, okay, at least I've pared it down to 2 hours of selects for a scene, and then I can go from there.
So generally, turning a beloved musical, into a film, you're going to have to make certain sacrifices. Like there's no way you're going to keep the same number of performances. A musical could be 3 hours. For a film, you're probably trying to shoot somewhere between 2.5. You guys didn't go that route. It's 2 big movies. Was that something that was debated as you were part of the process, like how we go about delivering this story?
I didn't know if it was going to work, to be honest with you, because when you watch both the films, which I have, it's very satisfying, for sure. It's definitely a full story arc. Once we started thinking that the first movie was an origin story, like how does she become the Wicked Witch of the West, then the second part about the consequences of people's choices, it kind of felt a little bit more manageable. What we learned from Heights is that if you try to cut down too much or you try to lose a song, first of all, if you try to lose a song, fans get really upset about that. And then secondly, if you try to cut down everything between songs, it just feels like a big musical montage. So by having 2 parts, it just allowed us to breathe and get to know these characters and root for them and have time to develop Elphaba's origin story. That said, even as one part, we broke the hell out of it. I mean, we cut verses out, we lifted scenes. There used to not be a meet cute with Fiyero and Elphaba. We took songs out. We started the film as kids running to Munchkinland versus our big, gigantic opening. We did everything in our power to break it and make sure that we weren't being too self-indulgent because we knew the running time was still going to be long even for the first film. And, Oz's Ballroom, we didn't have to linger so much with making people feel awkward in that scene. We did everything as far as trying to make it as short as possible. But as we found with the same within the Heights, is that the more we did that, the less invested the audience was. And so we just had to believe that the time spent with all the development was time well spent. And then having something that feels like a big Empire Strikes Back cliffhanger at the end that you're like, yeah, let's go to the movies. We knew if we could deliver on that ending, then that would be a reason for people to return for the second part.
For a musical or any kind of theatrical performance, it's big and broad and you're playing to the back of the room. There is no detail because the audience can't see that detail. This is an opportunity to take this story and just sort of sprinkle in so many little grace notes that you just don't get in a live performance.
Yeah, I mean, close up, we don't have a close up when you're watching theater. You can't go stare down at shiz from a helicopter. We can't have flying monkeys.
Oh, yes, you can.
Yeah, there's a lot of limitations, but I found that having a cinematic palette to these musicals allow you to just, you just get to expand your universe and you get to use all the things from cinema, from the close-up to the big epic shots of Munchkinland and Emerald City to basically paint Oz again. And also, there's things about the stage musical that I love. I still love how popular it makes me feel. So capturing this sort of spirit and fun of the stage show and bringing that to Ari's, rendition, you're trying to do both, if that makes sense.
It does. I already asked you about just the organizational process. I've heard of editors doing super groups as a way of managing all of that stuff. What is your particular process for how you take what could be just a massive number of cameras and angles to pull it together into how you can effectively tell a story through this musical number?
So I have my assistants do supergroups and I have them do script syncing, but I didn't use any of it.
Did they get upset about doing all that work and you didn't use it?
No, because they know I just want the tools in case I need it. If I can't find the shot or if I can't, find the line read in the form of vocals, then I have it. But I pretty much rely on my selects to build these sequences. And if there's ever a director or producer ever needing to no, it was right there, that shot, then I could say, okay, let's go through the supergroup or the script sync. So just having the tools available in case I need it is great, but I tend to not rely on it because I feel like it's a bit of a crutch. And so I try my best to rely on my process, which is no different than cutting any other scene. I think that maybe what I love about Wicked is that there's a very seamless feeling between dialogue scenes and musical numbers. And I think it's because of that approach, whereas we don't treat anything differently, that all of it should feel seamless. Flowing into one or another should be all the same sort of process.
Part of that process and making sure things flow from one to the other, there are going to be times where numbers are going to be stacked a little bit just by nature. And there's going to be times when there's gaps where it's more dialogue driven for a certain amount of time. Typically, that's not something you have to worry about in telling a straight ahead dramatic story, but how you load the performances in the film, is that something you think about?
Yeah. Knowing that there's not a song for another 10 minutes or something makes you feel like, oh, we need another song, but also just feels a bit terrifying because you're like, this is a musical. How do I keep that thread going? But, I don't cut the performances any differently as far as giving me more real estate or less real estate. But I do rely a lot on my music editors to help find connective tissue musically, even in my temp score. Like Jack Dolman, I brought on pretty early on during the process of while we were shooting. I need you to build a temp score because something like Dancing Through Life, which is basically like a 10-minute musical number that crosses many scenes and locations, we needed connective tissue. And so him even building that in temp, it kind of reminds you you're still in a musical in some ways. And working tirelessly with him and John and Catherine, our other music editor. And then when we go back to Stephen Schwartz or John Powell, and they're like, okay, do your version of this, then they have a bit of a roadmap as far as okay, we're still feeling we're in musical land, even though so there's quotes from the song, there's little elements that really allow us to just sort of kind of maintain that sort of vibe that we're still in this thing. That way it doesn't feel so surprising when 10 minutes later you're like, oh yeah, there's another song here. It's also, you're trying your best to make songs feel earned and that they don't feel like, okay, we stopped the movie and now we're doing this musical number. And so just trying to make sure that the scenes feel like they're building, it feels like an earned moment for them to start singing where they can't otherwise say something in dialogue.
We're talking about one of the biggest musicals of all time, and I haven't asked you anything about the singing. As I understand it, the vocals were recorded live on set, which is interesting because it wasn't long ago I was talking to Jeff Groth about Joker 2, we'll call it, and same thing, vocals recorded live on set. Couldn't come up with two different movies if you tried, but I'd like to know how your process compared to what they did and how it impacts you as an editor, that vocals recorded on set aspect.
It's just more painful. I mean, it's just like you just have so many more options because with this cast, every take is an amazing take vocally. And so I didn't get too precious about how I picked that performance because I knew that was going to be picked apart at some point. But again, my approach was what things moved me or that I thought was funny, all performance based. I didn't treat vocals any differently. I just treated it like recorded dialogue. And then if we wanted to sort of get more into the weeds as far as cutting specific vowels or notes, then we could do that later with our music editors. And of course, I also had pre-records. So the more physical stuff at first, I couldn't not be bothered, but I couldn't get too in the weeds as far as the physicality of Ari doing Popular and trying to make sure that she was doing the right vocals all the time. So sometimes I would first cut what I thought was the most outstanding physical humor, and then I'd go back with the music editors and find the right live vocals. And sometimes it'll be literally synced up to the take that I was using. And sometimes it was a little cheat here and there.
Well, earlier I asked you about the number of cameras that Jon was using, and you said, for the big scenes, just a ton, but it could be just one with an alternate angle for a more intimate scene. How does cutting like a solo musical number, such as when Elphaba sings I'm Not That Girl, compare to a big full company number like Dancing Through Life?
I always say that the really simple scenes are much harder to cut than the ones with a lot of cameras or big action, like the ones that are really intimate and you're just sitting with the performers. So, of course, just getting the right takes from the get-go and then finding really elegant ways to present that, it's much harder because you're just staring at or listening to a classic guitarist playing in front of you. I'm Not That Girl, for example, I really love the sort of dissolve transitions. I really love the sort of vibe that, I had to pitch Jon these dissolves, and he's not a fan of dissolves sometimes, but I am. Kevin Tent, if you're hearing this, he knows how much I love his dissolves. But, there was devices that invoked to me the Hollywood golden age, and I just wanted to use some of those. And something like I'm Not That Girl, you just sitting there watching Cynthia, every note has to be played right as far as every edit as well.
I'm sure I've asked you this before, but it's worth touching on again. Comparing a musical to like a big action movie. In an action movie, you get a lot of previs, stunt viz, things like that. How much, if anything, is pre-built for you ahead of time? Are there certain structures you can work with even before you start cutting?
Sometimes there's storyboards and previs. There's previs for Defying Gravity. Didn't end up being the shots that we ended up using, but it helped allow me to sort of have a little bit of a roadmap as far as like how she's flying around. Most of the time, I don't use any of it. I kind of can't stand the idea of anybody dictating how I'm going to approach a scene until I start cutting it. Sometimes I'll know that stuff is around and look at it, but oftentimes I just want to approach the footage like I found it on the street, and I started making my collage in my dorm room. And sometimes Jon will say, hey, I have an idea for this scene. Do you want to hear it? And I always say no. And he respects that because he knows that I just want to have my own take on it. And oftentimes we're like, okay, I've made a mess of this. What was your idea? But I try my best to, whether it's a big action sequence or an intimate number like I'm Not That Girl, I try to not approach it any differently, which is just like, give me all the stuff and then I'll make something out of it.
I think we're seeing a theme start to form here, Myron, whether it's eschewing storyboards or the script sync stuff or the supergroups. You just like, whatever. I'm just going to go by my heart and my instinct.
I feel like my superpower is maybe not so much my instinct because my instincts are working against me, but I think my heart is in the right place as far as like approaching the footage and like what moves me and what do I think is exciting to me. And oftentimes I make these weird mistakes the way I approach things, but that also opens doors to other ideas that would have never came if I had been dictated something. So using my heart as far as my compass in things is kind of where I'm leaning towards these days. And I feel more connected to that than I have ever had in my career.
Well, that's a good place to be. Let's transition a little bit into more of the visual aspects of it. Peter Dinklage is the voice of Dr. Dilon, who is a CGI goat that teaches history at Shiz University. Was Peter there on set giving a performance, or did he do the lines after the fact and the CGI was done to match?
Yeah, he was one of our last ADR that we did in the movie. So it was actually a female goat in the form of a person basically just in stilts and stuff walking around in that room. And she was doing the lines. But that was just to help guide me a little bit. And then Peter was like way down the line. So we were actually starting on VFX way before we even had Peter, crafting it. Of course, once Peter started doing it, then Dilon really came to life. And, that was pretty much the same thing with Dulcibert, who's in the beginning of the movie, and even Chistry, who doesn't talk, but they're all guiding us. But a lot of this, we just had to leave up to our own imagination.
VFX, to get your movie out on time, you've got to give them certain things in a certain order. Does it feel like in a film like this that they do have more of an influence over what you've got to work on and when?
100%. There was over 2,000 VFX shots in the film, and that's not every shot, but it's most of them. And so there was this constant, not battle of wills, but just battle of schedule as far as this shot is going to take a year to make. And you're like, really? And you're like, yes, it's that complicated. And you're like, okay, I guess that means tomorrow I need to give you all the elements for it. And so it's really frustrating because you want to give everybody everything all the time, but then you have to cut the movie. And then they're like, there's budgetary concerns as far as like, at one point there was like maybe a dozen monkeys in the Hall of Grandiosity. And I was just like, no, I want an army of monkeys.
And what editor doesn't want an army of monkeys? You would not be the first.
And I was like, editor raising his hand, like, can you make that 100 monkeys? And then at first I was like, 400 monkeys. They're like, 400 monkeys will cost us $40 million. We can't do that. And then we finally came to a number and they were like, okay, so now you get your monkeys. You need to turn over all those shots now because it's going to take 6 months to actually do this right. And they're like, oh, right. Ed Marsh, my amazing VFX editor, we were working on the balloon chase together. And it's just like, what do you think of this idea of when the balloon goes up and it gets caught in the thing, then when it bangs down, the fire lights the balloon on fire. And they're like, great idea. You need to roll those shots now if you want to get started on fire and this Hindenburg moment or something. And so it was a big learning curve because I didn't know post-viz from Previz to working on CG animals. I hadn't done any of it before this movie. And so having somebody like Ed and then, you know, Pablo Hellman and Kevin Elam, who is our VFX producer and supervisor, sort of teaching me along the way about the workflow on this scale was just like terrifying. And then at the end, you're like, okay, I think I can do this now. I've done a little bit of it. We have kids, we have CG animals, we have flying monkeys, we have balloon chases, monkey chases, got it all.
Since we are in the Thanksgiving and holiday season, I should ask you, Myron, after making it this far with this film and being well into the next one, what are you thankful for?
Oh, I'm thankful for my team. I have the best post-production team on the planet. They had my back for the last 2 years, and I would not have been able to make this movie. Or for that matter, you can't make any great piece of art without the team and artisans behind you. So I'm very thankful for them. You know, I said to Laura, like, you need to find the best team in LA and in London, or we're going to kill each other in 2 years, 3 years, you know, and she did. And so I'm very thankful for her and thankful for the team. We made something really special together. So that's it for sure.
Well, that's a great answer. Listen, I know you got to go, but you did such a fantastic job on this film. You've been on it for so long. And I do have to wonder, after months and months of working on musical material, do you find that you start speaking to your assistants with vibrato?
Oh, yeah. We're singing to each other up and down that edit room for sure.
I don't know. You'd have to think if you spent 2 years working on a musical, at the very least, you'd be absent-mindedly humming the music on your way home from the cutting room. And I'm pretty sure you will when you leave the movie. Congrats to Myron and his crew. As you heard, so much work went into making this movie happen. For quite a while, others tried to make this movie happen and just couldn't close the deal. And for whatever reason that it never happened before, it would be hard to argue that it wasn't for the best that it ended up in Myron's capable hands. A big thanks to Myron for squeezing us in to talk about Wicked. He is always fun to talk to, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You know, you can ask the wizard for a heart. You can ask him for courage. You can ask him for a brain. You can even ask him for a ride home to Kansas. But you don't have to see the wizard to get the same editing tools Myron used to cut Wicked. For that, all you have to do is visit the Media Composer page on avid.com. And even though Myron never ended up using script sync or supergroups for Wicked, I still think his assistants are secretly pissed about doing all that work that didn't get used. But you could use those things. You could use all kinds of great tools in Media Composer, and they get better all the time. And to see for yourself, you don't have to click your Ruby Slippers 3 times. You only have to click that link I put in the show notes once. Okay, it can be so hard to say goodbye, but say goodbye we must. Time to leave the Emerald City and get back to work. Thanks for dropping by this week. I hope you're doing okay and keeping busy, and I hope someone is paying you well for editing something fun. Maybe you'll be on the podcast somewhere down the Yellow Brick Road instead of just listening to it. I look forward to that. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.